Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the quantitative methodology chapter. Just before we get started with the presentation, I would like to present this information in case you're interested in additional support outside of this webinar. So we do provide assistance with all aspects of the dissertation. So if you are interested in more one-on-one support outside of this webinar, you can use the information that you see here to contact us and learn more about the different types of assistance that we provide. So first, I'll just give an overview of what we'll be covering today. So this presentation will be on the components of the quantitative methodology chapter. We will not be discussing the qualitative methodology today. We do have other webinars that cover components of the qualitative methodology chapter. But first, we'll talk about the purpose of the methodology chapter, and then we'll talk about what should go into each of the components of the methodology chapter. So we'll go through the introduction, research design, talk about the population and sample, instrumentation, data collection, and data analysis procedures, limitations, and ethical considerations. And then at the end of the presentation, we will have opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you do have a question during the presentation, you can type it into the questions section. And at the end of the presentation, any questions that were answered over the course of the presentation, I will attempt to answer during the questions section. So we will save the questions for the end of the presentation. So first, let's talk about the purpose of the methodology chapter. So why is the methodology chapter important to the dissertation? So the methodology chapter is designed to describe how you will be conducting your research. So in the prior chapters of the dissertation leading up to the methodology, namely your introduction and literature review chapters, you're discussing why you are conducting your research. You're setting up the rationale for why your study is important and needs to be done. Once you get to the methodology chapter, it's time to talk about how you are going to carry out the research to answer your research objectives. And so the methodology chapter should be detailed enough that your research can be replicated by others. Someone should be able to read your methodology chapter and be able to carry out the research study in the exact same way that you did. So you want to think of the methodology chapter almost like a set of instructions or an instruction manual that you're writing for someone to follow to be able to conduct your research. Others will liken the methodology chapter to a recipe where the methodology may have many different components, such as the instrumentation and the sample and population. And you have to kind of put those components together and create a step-by-step guide for how you are going to conduct that study and put all those things together and do a research study. It's very important to note that although we are going to be covering the components that are most typical to the quantitative methodology chapter, based on our experience with many different schools and programs, it's important to check your specific school's guidelines to determine what are the requirements that are specific to you. So your school may have slightly different sections than what we present today. They may require more sections, they may require fewer sections, they may require slightly different information to be in some of the sections. So you always want to defer to what your specific school or degree program requires, although we'll be providing kind of a roadmap for what most typically appears in the methodology chapter. So now let's start to talk about some of the components of the chapter. And much like other chapters of the dissertation, the methodology chapter usually starts with a basic introduction where you reorient your reader to the purpose and the research questions of your study, and then give them a preview of what is going to appear in the chapter. So you can usually start the introduction by just restating your purpose or problem statement. And depending on what your school requires, you may just restate the purpose or problem statement verbatim, or it may just be a brief summary statement of your purpose or problem from previous chapters. And you'll also want to state the research questions or hypotheses, or restate them if they've already appeared in earlier chapters of your paper. It's important to note that wherever your research questions and hypotheses appear in your dissertation document, they should appear with the exact same wording in all chapters. So every time you state your research questions and hypotheses, the wording should be exactly the same. They should never change throughout the document. And so after you reorient the reader to your study purpose and your research questions, you just want to give a preview of the sections of the chapter. And this can really just be as simple as listing the different section headings that will appear in the methodology chapter. Typically, after the introduction comes the research design section. And so in this section, you want to discuss the research design that you have chosen for your study and give rationale for why this is the best research design for answering your research questions. It's worth noting that depending on your school's requirements, you may also need to discuss not only the research design, but the general methodological approach or methodology. And that would be, for instance, why you chose a quantitative method over a qualitative method or a mixed method, for instance. That's different from the research design with it, which is specific to quantitative. But your school may require you to provide rationale for both the general methodology, so why did you pick quantitative, and for the specific research design within quantitative that you chose. But for the research design part, you'll want to start by stating what specific research design you've selected. So whether it's correlational, experimental, quasi-experimental, causal comparative, or another design, you want to state what that design is, and you want to state why the design was selected for your study. So you'll want to talk about this in relation to your problem, purpose, and research questions. The research design should align with those aspects of your study. So you should be able to rationalize your selection of the research design based on those things. For instance, if you are doing a correlational study, for instance, that may be because your problem, purpose, and research questions have to do with looking at relationships between variables. And so that would be aligned with a correlational study. And so you want to frame your rationale in terms of why the specific research design is appropriate based on your problem, purpose, and research questions. You may also need to discuss why you didn't select other types of research designs. So for instance, if you're doing a correlational study, you may need to talk about why you did not pick an experimental study or why you did not pick a causal comparative study. So you'll want to briefly talk about those types of designs and why they were not appropriate for your study. So for instance, maybe it wasn't appropriate for you to do an experimental study because you're only looking at relationships between variables and you're not able to manipulate any of the variables or randomly assign participants to conditions, which would be required for experimental research. So those would be reasons why you would not pick an experimental design. And just going back to the note about the general methodological approach, if you are required to discuss the general methodology and the rationale for that, you want to include the same elements as you did with the research design. So you'll want to state the general approach, which in this case would be quantitative. You'll want to explain why quantitative was the appropriate method to choose. And you'll want to explain why other methods, such as qualitative and mixed methods, were not appropriate for your study. So now let's talk about the population and the sample. And this is a part of the methodology where a lot of students can get confused because sometimes there's confusion over the difference between the population and the sample. These are two different things, and it's important to make the distinction between them. The population, to start off with, is the broad group of individuals that your results are intended to generalize to. So, for instance, if you are doing a nursing study, your population of interest might be all registered nurses in the United States, for instance. Or if you're doing a research study based on a more local problem, maybe your population would be registered nurses in the Southwest United States. So it could possibly be more specific, but the population refers to the broad group of people that your study is about or that your results are intended to generalize to. And so for the population portion, you want to just state that population of interest. So you want to define that population. And if possible, you want to describe the characteristics of that population and provide an estimate of the population size. So for instance, if you're doing that study on registered nurses in the United States, you may want to provide an estimate for how many registered nurses there are in the United States. You might get this information from some kind of source like Bureau of Labor Statistics or something similar that reports those types of numbers in the general population. Depending on what your population is, it may or may not be possible for you to get exact numbers. You may have to just provide your best estimate based on the information that's available to you. Now, the population is different from the sample, which is just the individuals that you select from the population who will actually participate in your study. So the sample is only those people who are participating. And so you can think of the difference between the population and sample in terms of a fishing analogy. So imagine that you're taking a trip out to a lake to go fishing. When you go out to go fishing at the lake, you're probably not going to catch every single fish in the lake. You're probably only going to catch a few fish if you're lucky. So you can think of all of the fish in the entire lake as the population, and your sample is just the few fish that you catch that day. And so in that way, it's important to distinguish between those individuals that make up your general population and those individuals who will actually participate in your study. You'll want to describe your specific sampling strategy or technique that you're going to use to select individuals from the population to be in your sample. So different sampling strategies might include random sampling techniques where each individual in the population has an equal chance of being selected, or convenience sampling where you pick people based on what is most readily available to you. In most dissertation level studies, depending on what exactly your population is, it's likely not feasible for you to do a true random sample, especially if you have a very big population like all registered nurses in the United States. It's not likely that you're going to be able to ensure that you do a true random sample from a population that's that large. You'll likely have to do some kind of non-probability or convenience sample. And so you'll want to describe exactly how that sample is going to be selected from the population and recruited into your study. So if you are doing some kind of convenience sample, where exactly are you selecting those participants from? Are they, for instance, in a nursing study, are they going to be just from a local hospital? or a collection of local hospitals, or are you going to sample them from perhaps some kind of nursing association where you might have access to an email list of members of that nursing association that you can contact? And how exactly are you going to be contacting these people? Will you be getting their email addresses from the hospitals, or will you be posting recruitment materials in the hospitals like flyers? Or are you going to be contacting those nursing associations and having the nursing association post your study invitation to their members? How exactly are you going to be contacting these individuals so that they can learn about your study and decide if they want to participate? You'll want to be as detailed as possible about the different recruitment methods that you're going to be using to contact potential participants. Then the final aspect of the sample section would be the determination of a target sample size. So for a quantitative study, you will want to determine the appropriate or target sample size for the analysis that you propose to do. And for most quantitative research, this is done by conducting a power analysis using software such as GPower. And I won't go into a lot of detail about power analysis in this presentation because we do have other webinars that are dedicated specifically to power analysis for quantitative studies. So if you are more interested in that topic and learning how to calculate the appropriate target sample size, I'd encourage you to look into those specific webinars. So now let's talk about the instrumentation. So for the instrumentation section, you want to state and describe the different instruments you're going to be using to measure each variable in your study. So typically, for every variable that you have listed in your research questions and hypotheses, you will need some kind of instrument to measure that variable. For instance, if you're doing some kind of a survey study and your research questions and hypotheses measure things like self-esteem or self-efficacy or leadership qualities, you will need an instrument to measure each one of those things. And for each instrument, you want to state the instrument you're using. So if it has a name, state the name of the instrument. And you'll want to describe the details of that instrument. For instance, if it's a survey instrument, how many items or questions are in that instrument? Is it a 10-question survey? Does it have 20 questions? How many items does it have? You'll want to describe the response scale and scoring information for the instrument. So how are participants responding to each of the items? Are they responding on some kind of a Likert scale where they rate each statement on a scale from, for instance, 1 to 5 or 1 to 7, ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree? How are they rating each item? And how are you scoring those items? So if it's a 10-question instrument, for instance, are you taking the responses to those 10 questions and adding them together or averaging them to create an overall score for that variable? Or are you scoring the instrument in some other way? Basically, you want to provide enough detail to describe how you are going to arrive at the score for the particular variable that you are using that instrument to measure. In addition to the details about the instrument itself, you'll also want to provide evidence for each instrument's validity and reliability. And oftentimes, and again, this depends on your specific school's requirements, but some schools will oftentimes require this information to go in a completely separate and dedicated section. So you might have a specific section for validity and a specific section for reliability where you'd provide this information for each of the instruments. For validity, you want to report on statistical tests for validity, such as factor analysis, and you would usually find this information in the original article that describes how the instrument was developed. And for reliability, you want to describe statistics such as reliability coefficients like Cronbach's alpha, or possibly test-retest correlations, whatever the previous authors have used to establish the reliability of the instrument. And again, this information is typically found in the original article that describes how the instrument was created and developed. Now, after you've described the different instruments you'll be using, you will want to then describe your actual data collection procedures. And this is one of the most important sections of the methodology, because this is where that step-by-step, exactly how you're going to be conducting the research part gets described. So you want to just go through step by step, almost like a recipe or an instruction book, how you're going to be collecting the data. So it should start right from the point where you get your IRB approval. Once you get your IRB approval to start data collection, what's the very first step that you're going to do from that point? And then just go through all of the steps needed to complete the data collection up to the point where you're ready to start your analysis. And again, you should be writing this in a way that it's detailed enough so that someone else could read it and be able to repeat it and conduct the exact same study that you did. You'll want to provide details such as where and how the data collection will take place. So if you're doing a survey study, for instance, will this be an in-person survey where you have people come in and fill out paper and pencil questionnaires? Or will it be an online survey? So people just complete it from their own home computers and you send them the survey link via email. You'll want to talk about how participants will provide their informed consent. So this is an important part of any research study with human participants, where you need to present them with information about the study so that they're informed about the study and can make the decision to participate or not before they answer any other questions. So how will you be giving them this information? If it's an online study, typically you would present the consent form as the first page of your online survey. So that might be one way that participants would provide their consent. And then you'll also want to talk about how and when each instrument will be administered. And this is especially important if you're doing a longitudinal or a repeated measure study where you're collecting data at multiple different points in time. So if you're doing that kind of a study, it's very important to discuss at what points will the data be collected, how much time will pass in between the different phases of the data collection, and exactly what data will be collected at each point. If you're doing a simple survey study, maybe you have multiple survey instruments that you're using to measure a couple different variables. In that case, what order are you going to present those instruments in? That might be something that you would discuss. Now, note that these data collection procedures and what you write about may be a little bit different if you're doing a study on archival or secondary data. So a lot of students will collect primary data themselves, but others may use data that's already existing. So you may be taking data from some kind of nationally representative data set or some other data set that already exists and doing your own analysis on it. If that's the case, then you want to focus your data collection procedures on the steps that you need to take to get access to that data. So in those cases, you might describe where you're getting the data, what permissions you need in order to access the data, and how exactly that data is going to be delivered to you. And after you talk about the data or data collection procedures, Then you want to talk about your data analysis plan. So you want to be able to discuss exactly what analysis you propose to run in order to answer your research questions and hypotheses. So you need to have that planned out in advance. So you want to first describe how your data are going to be compiled and entered into an electronic format that can be used by a stats software. And this is especially important if you are doing a study that involves paper and pencil data collection. So if you're doing an in-person paper and pencil survey, you'll want to describe the process for entering those data into an electronic format that a stats program can use. You'll want to state the specific statistics software that you're using for the data cleaning and analysis. So you might use something like SPSS or Intellectus Statistics or Excel for those things. You'll want to describe in detail how you will clean and prepare the data for analysis. So this can involve checking data for missing values, checking data for eligibility, checking it for accuracy, and checking for things like outliers. So you'll want to plan for how you're going to conduct all of those steps. So for instance, for missing data, how are you going to deal with participants who are or who have missing values? Are you just going to completely exclude or delete any participants who didn't answer all of the questions? Or are you going to try to retain participants who might be missing a few questions? And if so, how are you going to deal with those missing values? Are you going to replace them or impute them in some way? Or are you going to handle those missing data some other way? So you want to plan for how you do that. You'll also want to make sure you check the data for accuracy and eligibility. So if you have specific inclusion criteria for your data, you'll want to check and make sure that all of the participants in your data set meet those inclusion criteria based on their responses to the questions or the information that they provided. And especially if you have to manually enter data from something like a paper and pencil questionnaire, you want to check over those data entries to make sure that the data were entered accurately. Because anytime you introduce that kind of process, there's a chance for human error where maybe you typed in a number wrong when you're entering the data. So you want to go back and check and make sure all of that data entry is accurate. After you've talked about the data preparation, you want to start getting into the different analyses you're going to conduct. So you'll probably start with some descriptive statistics just to give general demographic characteristics of your sample and to provide descriptives for your variables of interest. So you might provide frequencies and percentages for categorical variables and things like mean and standard deviation for any continuous variables that you have. And you'll want to describe the analysis that you're going to use to answer each research question and hypothesis. So this should just be in order of your research questions typically. So especially if you're doing a separate analysis for each research question. So you can start with research question 1, say for research question 1, I'm going to do a t-test, or for research question 1, I'm going to do an ANOVA. You'll want to identify the different variables that you're going to be using in each analysis and the different statistics that you're going to be computing for that analysis. Such as, if you're doing a t-test, state what your independent and dependent variables are, state what statistics you're going to compute, like the t-statistic and the p-value, and how you're going to interpret that. And for each test, for each of your research questions, you're also going to want to describe the assumptions of those tests. So basically any statistical test that you do, or any inferential test rather, will have some assumptions associated with that test. So you'll want to describe what those assumptions are and how you're going to test for each of those assumptions. For instance, if you're doing a t-test, you might have to test the assumptions of normality and homogeneity of variance. So you'll want to describe exactly how you're going to test each of those things. And you also may want to describe what your backup plan is going to be if any of those assumptions are violated. So for instance, if normality is violated, are you going to do an alternative test like a non-parametric test, or are you going to try to transform the data in some way to account for the violation of that assumption? You want to have all of that planned out in advance here in the data analysis plan portion of your paper. So one of the last sections in the methodology chapter may be the limitations. And some schools may not even have this section, but a lot of schools do require you to discuss the specific limitations of your research design. This may be different from the limitations section that may appear in earlier chapters, such as the introduction chapter, where you talk about general limitations of your study. When you talk about limitations in the methodology chapter, these are limitations that are specific to your chosen research design. So different research designs will have different methodological limitations. So for instance, for correlational studies, the main limitation of those is that you cannot determine cause and effect from these types of studies. If you're doing survey research, limitations that you might discuss may include response biases. So people may have social desirability bias or some kind of other response bias that may affect their answers. That's a limitation of survey research. There are certain limitations associated with longitudinal or pre-test, post-test studies, such as attrition, testing effects, history, and maturation. Those are all things that can affect the results of those types of studies. And then for experimental studies, you may want to discuss limitations in terms of external validity. So how well is your experiment, the results of your experiment rather, going to generalize to real world situations? Usually the final section of the methodology chapter deals with ethical considerations. So in this chapter, you want to discuss all of the ethical issues relevant to your study and relevant to the specific data collection procedures that you propose to carry out. A lot of times, schools will want you to specifically discuss the principles of the Belmont Report, which sets standards for conducting ethical research with human participants. And the main principles that are discussed in the Belmont Report include beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. And you'll usually want to explain each of these principles and explain how you are going to be upholding those principles as you conduct your research. You'll want to talk about IRB, or Institutional Review Board approval. Virtually all studies will need some kind of approval from an IRB, so you want to talk about that process and how you're going to get IRB approval before you collect any data. And you'll want to talk about how your participants will provide informed consent if you haven't already discussed that in a previous section. You'll want to talk about how you're going to be protecting participants in your study. So you'll want to talk about the different risks involved in your study and how you're going to be protecting participants from those risks. A lot of students will make the mistake of saying that their study involves no risk. Even if it's something relatively innocuous, like an online survey, it's not necessarily true to say that there's no risk involved in a study like that. Any study involves at least some kind of risk. It's just that some studies may have only minimal risk. So if you're doing online survey research, that's probably a minimal risk study. But you still want to discuss the fact that there may be risks and what you're going to do to mitigate any possible risks. And this discussion becomes even more important if your study is less benign. and is more involved, like it's some kind of experimental study, or maybe it's a biomedical research study where there are more risks possible than if people were just conducting simple survey research. So in those cases, you'll want to discuss in detail what the potential risks are and what you're going to be doing to mitigate those risks. In any case, you'll want to talk about, since you'll be collecting information from participants, you'll want to talk about how participants' identities and information will be protected. So are you collecting the data anonymously where you're not collecting any personal identifiers? Or are you collecting personal identifiers, but you're keeping that information confidential? You'll want to describe that process. So how are you going to be protecting the information? And how are the data going to be stored? How are you going to be protecting that? So are the data going to be stored electronically on a password protected computer or an encrypted cloud storage, or are they going to be stored in some other way? If you're collecting physical data like paper and pencil survey responses, then how is that going to be stored? Is it going to be stored in a secure location? How is that going to be secured? And then after the study is over, how is the data going to be destroyed? Typically, schools will have guidelines for how long the researcher is required to keep the data after the study is over, and then will require you to destroy that data a certain amount of time after the study has been completed. So you should refer to your school's guidelines for those specific procedures. And so that brings us to the end of the presentation on the different components of the quantitative methodology chapter. Again, if you're interested in additional support outside of these webinars, you can use the information that you see here to get in touch with us to determine what additional support we can provide you. And with that, I will get into the questions section of the webinar. So if you do have any questions, you can feel free to type those into the questions section now, and I will do my best to answer any questions that you might have. So I'm looking now. It doesn't look like any questions have been submitted so far, but if you do have any questions now, you can submit them at this time. So one question is, can we talk more about the analysis of the collected data? So we can go back to the data analysis plan portion. And so really for this section, you'll want to make sure that you have a plan to for an analysis to answer each of your research questions. So by the end of this section, you should be able to say how each of your research questions or hypotheses is going to be answered or addressed, and point to a specific analysis that's going to answer that question. So if you have 5 different research questions, for instance, you may have 5 different analyses that you're going to be conducting to answer those questions. Or it might be possible that you have a set of research questions that will be answered with one analysis, like for instance, a multiple linear regression, where you have a research question about each predictor in your regression. In that case, you might have one analysis that answers a couple of different research questions. But the important thing is that you want to make sure that you have a plan for answering each research question. You don't want to, leave anything out, or have a research question that you don't have an analysis plan for. And at the same time, you don't really want to write up an analysis plan or analyses for things that are unrelated to your research questions. So you don't necessarily want to do a bunch of analyses that are irrelevant to or unrelated to the research questions. But at the same time, you also want to make sure that each of the analyses that you do propose for your research questions, you describe the assumptions that you're testing for those analyses, and your plan for if any of those assumptions are violated. So those are the main things that you'll want to consider for the analysis plan. So another question is there a standard letter to ask permission for use of the instrument from the author of the instruments? So I wouldn't say there is a template or a standard letter, but typically you can just write a very brief email. You say, hi, my name is David. I'm doing a research study for my dissertation. I'm interested in using your instrument that measures this variable. Will you give me permission to use this instrument? And it really doesn't have to be too much more than that. You basically just want to introduce yourself, saying why you're conducting the research, and just ask them if you can use that instrument and have access to it to use it for your study. And so another question is, what process do you recommend for a researcher to recruit statistician for study? Well, we do help with the statistical portion of the dissertation. So that is a big part of what we do, is we provide consulting directly for the analysis and provide support for the statistical analysis portion of the dissertation. So if you want to know the best process for recruiting a statistician, then I would point you to the information here to contact us for that additional support, so you can learn more about the types of support and assistance that we provide for that part of the dissertation. All right, looks like those were all the questions so far. If anyone else has any other questions, you can feel free to type those in now, and I'll allow another minute or two for more questions to come in. And another question is, I wonder if most actually outsource the stat portion of the research. Is it common to hire someone to do what we do? And the answer is yes, it is common. And schools will sometimes actually encourage their students to hire a tutor or a consultant for specific parts of the dissertation, or hire an editor, or hire a statistician to help them with the stats. So it's definitely a common thing. It's something that some schools and committee members or chairs will actually encourage. So um, so if you're feeling hesitant about that part of it, you should know that it definitely is common for students to seek outside help with this aspect of the dissertation, especially if you um, are not completely confident in your knowledge or abilities with statistics. That's something that you can definitely reach out for help with. So another question is there a special way to collect or organize data collection to aid in statistical analysis? So you do want to make sure that when you propose your data collection procedures, that you kind of set yourself up for success in order to properly do your analysis and answer your research questions. But a lot of that is just doing pretty simple things, like making sure your procedures are very detailed, making sure that you secure an instrument to measure each of your variables, making sure it's the correct instrument, making sure that that instrument will give you the measure you need um, in order to properly measure each variable and answer the research questions. Because I've seen situations with some students where they propose a certain data collection plan, but maybe things don't go according to plan. Maybe they don't um, really have access to the instrument that they plan to use, and then they have to come up with some kind of a backup. That's why when you do your um, data collection plan or your plan for your instrumentation, it's often good to look for multiple instruments, um, or look for different options for instruments for certain variables, so that you have a backup in case the instrument that you originally intended to use does not work out for you. So the common situation is that a student will identify an instrument, um, they'll get their proposal approved, and then they'll contact the author to try to get permission, but then the author doesn't get back to them, or they can't get access to the instrument. So you want to make sure you do that homework ahead of time. So you kind of want to lay that groundwork before you get too far into the process, and make sure that you can secure those instruments and actually carry out your data collection procedures the way you intend to, before you get too deep into it. And if for some reason you can't carry out those procedures the way you intended to, you might want to have a little bit of a backup plan in case that doesn't work out, like having a backup instrument, um, or a backup recruitment procedure in case your original recruitment procedure doesn't work out. Like maybe, for instance, you're doing a nursing study and you plan to recruit nurses from a specific hospital, like you're in touch with the people at the hospital and think that they'll be able to help you recruit people. But then when it comes time to do your data collection, or it gets closer to that point, for some reason the hospital changes its mind and says, no, actually, we can't help you with this. In that case, it's good to have a backup method of recruitment in case something like that happens to you. So you do want to make sure you kind of prepare as far in advance as possible to see what's going to be feasible for you, find out what things aren't feasible, and to come up with alternative plans if it turns out the things that you want to do are not going to work for you. So those are the best suggestions that I can really give to set yourself up to do a proper data analysis and get the data you need. All right, so if anyone else has any additional questions, can feel free to type those in now. It looks like those are all the questions about the content for the webinar. If you do have additional questions about our other webinars or what's available, our webinars are going to be available for you um, to download, and the slides will be available and all that. And if you are interested, again, in more additional help, additional consultation, more one-on-one support, you can use the information on the screen here to contact us and learn more about the services that we provide. I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar today. I hope everyone found it useful, and I hope everyone has a great day.